Let's talk about the North Korean soldiers possibly dying for the Russians in Ukraine. So there was a report that during a recent Ukrainian strike in occupied Ukraine, 6 North Korean advisory troops, or North Korean soldiers, their exact role is still ill-defined, were killed. This was said by the Ukrainian government, that they were able to kill 6 North Korean soldiers while striking a Russian position in occupied Ukraine. Now, have the North Koreans announced that they have soldiers in Ukraine? Have the Russians announced that they have North Korean soldiers in Ukraine? No, they have not. At least according to the North Korean and Russian governments, they have yet to release any statement about North Korean troop deployments in the country, or about whether or not these 6 soldiers actually died or not. But as of right now, we don't have any photographs, we don't have any video, we don't have any documentation. We just have the reports of the Ukrainian government. And I will say, while North Korea has provided a lot of support to the Russians, mostly in artillery production, giving them mass amounts of artillery, even if it's not of the same quality as a 155 millimeter shell that came straight off the line in Pennsylvania, a shell is still a shell, and if 3 out of 4 of them explode and do damage, that's still 3 out of 4 of them exploding and doing damage. So the North Koreans have provided them with rockets and missiles and ammunition and all of this stuff to help them throw munitions at the enemy, but we have yet to hear anything about them deploying soldiers. And there's always the possibility that the Ukrainians want the West to be as terrified of North Korean involvement as possible to try to motivate more support from the West. So I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm just saying that immediately on face value, accepting any report that there are North Korean soldiers in occupied Ukraine and that they're fighting for the Russians, or they're doing construction for the Russians, or just doing like ditch digging. They're just digging trenches for the Russians and doing construction work of some sort. We do not know. We do not know. But let's read this political report that is talking about what the South Koreans are saying, which is that they're likely already there. North Korea is likely sending its soldiers to fight and die in Ukraine alongside Russian troops, Seoul's defense minister said Tuesday. As Russia and North Korea have signed a mutual treaty akin to a military alliance, the possibility of such a deployment is highly likely. Now, what he's talking about is, like, within the last year, Putin visited North Korea. I think it was within the last 6 months. And while he was there, he signed a treaty with them that's supposed to be, it's like mutual cooperation and friendship and defense. And in this treaty, it did not clearly define what exactly defending each other would mean, whether it would just be assisting with a few munitions or a lot of munitions or what type of shells, but the idea is that they would defend each other and support each other. But what that defense and support was ill-defined. Whether it was ill-defined on purpose to give the Russians flexibility so they could shed themselves of their commitments once the North Korean ammunition supply is not needed, whether or not it was vague in order to give them time to prepare exactly that support for the Russians so the West would not be aware. What exactly it was, we still do not know, but that's what they're referencing. The one thing that we did see was that they were committed to each other's defense. What that means, again, still incredibly vague. As Russia and North Korea have signed a mutual treaty akin to a military alliance, the possibility of such a deployment is highly likely, South Korea's defense chief told the country's parliament, adding that more of Pyongyang's soldiers are likely to be deployed. The relationship between Russia and North Korea are evolving to be almost as close as a military alliance, he said. As such, more North Korean troops could be deployed in the war from how we look at it. Russia and North Korea have deepened their ties following Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, culminating a defense pact signed between the two countries in June. Okay, so it was back in June, when Putin visited the Asian country for the first time in 25 years. The pact, which represents a sign of the strongest partnership between the two since the Cold War, envisions mutual military assistance between Moscow and Pyongyang if either is attacked. Again, ill-defined exactly what that would be. The move added to concerns. Oh, and of course, if North Korea wasn't to invade into South Korea, this would almost I mean, we don't know for sure, but almost certainly not apply. The moves added to concerns in the West that North Korea is providing Moscow with munitions to wage its war in Ukraine in exchange for economic assistance and technology transfers. South Korea's defense chief also corroborated Ukrainian media's reports that North Korean soldiers have been killed by Kiev's troops as they fend off Putin's aggression. We believe there have been injuries and fatalities among North Korean troops in Ukraine. Both Russia and Ukraine have used foreign fighters in their rank as they face a shortage of troops. Yeah, but there's also an ability to leave Poland and America freely. There's not really an option to leave North Korea freely. I would say the labor markets are a little different here. But, you know, I doubt political meant anything by it. It was just being short and sweet. So recap. South Korea's defense chief, after we already know that North Korea has provided Russia with missiles, rockets, and artillery shells to support their ammunition depletion that they've experienced from firing tons and tons and tons of munitions at the Ukrainians, and moving forward mostly by having an overbearing supply of ammunition in comparison to their opponents. Now we're hearing reports from the South Koreans that North Korean troops might already be in Ukraine, and not only are they already in Ukraine likely, according to them, but that there's already likely casualties, including fatalities. And so that report we got from the Ukrainian government about the 6 killed would correspond, as they directly said, with the South Korean reports, which means that the Ukrainians are reporting North Korean troops killed in occupied Ukraine, and the South Koreans are saying that it's likely. Does that mean it's true? Well, not necessarily. Again, the South Koreans said likely, so it's not a confirmation from the South Koreans. And I'm going to be blunt here, even though, you know, I'm supportive of course, Ukraine's right to defend itself. Ukraine has every incentive in the world for the West to view it as attacked by all of America's enemies. And when you think about it, like Iran supports with the Shahed drones the Russians, which then bombs Ukraine. The Russians, of course, bomb Ukraine. The North Koreans supporting the Russians and bombing Ukraine. China supporting with consuming the energy export and sending CNC machines. And there's the recent secretive drone program that was reported. India is a little bit more complicated, as is true with all of the countries it has a relationship with. But a lot of these countries, or the vast majority of them, make up what would be considered the primary opponents of American power in the world. And so the more it looks like Ukraine's fighting all of them and their resources, the more incentive from not only like a strategic or tactical level, but from a credibility level, a credibility about American power, about the American system, about how America treats and supports its allies, could push America to say, well, we have to look like a better ally than the North Koreans. We have to look like a better ally than the Iranians. We can't abandon this country 1/5 the population size and like 1/20 or 1/10 the territorial size, the largest country with its territory entirely located within Europe, to just be conquered in this way based off of Iranian, North Korean, and Russian ammunition, and a combination of Russian and North Korean mercenaries and conscripts that they could scrape together to throw at them after face planting time and again, while the West is still holding restrictions on long-range strikes. And so the Ukrainians could have an incentive to be like, look, we're getting pressure from all of your enemies. You need to be more supportive. And I'm not saying that's the case, that is what's happening. It's just that the Ukrainians have an incentive. The South Koreans, that's the thing that probably concerns me much more, because the South Koreans are saying that it's likely. There's a lot less clear incentive for the South Koreans to lie about this, but they're also saying likely. Now, what could be the potential responses that the West could employ to this? Well, earlier in the year, when the Ukrainians were starving for ammunition and they needed something to support their counteroffensive down south, their now failed counteroffensive into Zaporizhia, they only got as far as Robotne, didn't get to Tokmak, which was supposed to be the first goal. They were looking for ammunition to supply their guns. They needed 155 millimeter shells, which is the NATO standard for stuff like the M777 howitzer. And one of the countries they ended up getting shells from was the South Koreans. Now, under South Korean law, they cannot directly export shells or weapons to Ukraine because it's an active war zone. Now, why a country would bother making weapons only to then say, well, you know, the things that are made for war and used to be made to be used in war, please do not send them to any war zone. Well, I mean, I guess, well, it's for diplomacy or what. Anyway, the restrictions on the weapon. And so what they did is they shipped the weapons, the artillery shells, to America, and then America shipped those shells to Ukraine from its own supply. And so indirectly, South Korea was able to support Ukraine. If South Korea changed the law, maybe South Korea could support Ukraine directly. Now, this would mean a change in the South Korean law. So that would mean working with the South Koreans to change that so they could send it more directly. But of course, they still have the same option as before. They could, for example, send maybe 1 million or 1.5 million shells indirectly through the United States, and then the United States ship those shells over to Ukraine in response to something like this, making it clear to the Russians that further cooperation with the North Koreans, which we are still trying to internationally isolate due to the ICBM and nuclear weapons program, is going to lead to further cooperation with other Asian Pacific allies with the Ukrainians as well, making him choose to go further at his own peril or pull back, which of course has its own benefits. Whether or not the Biden administration is going to do that is going to be dependent upon whether, number one, these reports are accurate and they're not being hyped up, or they're not an error in people's investigative duties, and whether or not they think that the best way to disincentivize further entanglement between the North Koreans and the Russians, or to create a deterrence for future cooperation with other American adversaries like the Houthis, is to increase cooperation between the South Koreans and the Ukrainians, which would be the most direct regional response. Man, isn't that crazy? South Korean and North Korean artillery munitions being shipped off the production lines, then to a battlefield halfway across the world that neither of them are directly fighting in, to be fired on opposite sides of the conflict.